Hey guys, Richard Holder here, and welcome to the channel. I got one question for you. Who makes the best small block? Is it Ford, Chevy, or Dodge? If we go to the wrecking yard and get a 350 Chevy, or a 351 Windsor, or a Dodge 360 Magnum, which one makes the most power? Let's find out. In this video, we are going to compare a trio of truck motors. That's right, we're starting off with a small block Chevy, a VORTEC 350. We're going to compare that to a Ford 351 Windsor, and then we're going to compare those two to a Dodge 360 Magnum. We're going to run them all on the same dyno. We're going to run them carbureted with dual plane manifolds, 4-barrel carburetor, and long tube headers. So the question is, who makes the best small block? Let's find out. To get things started on our comparison between the Ford, Chevy, and Dodge, we'll take a look first at the Dodge Magnum 360, and right off the bat you should recognize, hey, the Dodge Magnum should have a little bit of an advantage. It's 360 cubic inches compared to 351 for the Ford and 350 inches for the small block Chevrolet. So right off the bat, it should win because it's bigger, right? Well, that's what we're going to take a look at. The Dodge Magnum, in this case, actually was a Mopar Performance crate motor. And I know what you're thinking. Hey, Richard, the other two are junkyard motors. This is going to favor the Dodge. It actually doesn't, because the Dodge, the Mopar Performance crate motor, is just a stock motor with that dual plane M1 intake manifold on it, and then we put the Brawler 750 carburetor and long tube headers on it. And I know that it makes exactly the same power as a Junkyard 360 Magnum, because I took a Junkyard Magnum 360 out of the junkyard and ran it also with this intake and with the carburetor and with these exact headers. So we know what it does. It makes exactly this, and it's not surprising. The Mopar Performance crate motor, the 300 horse version, is just a production line engine with that intake manifold on there. So this is what they make. So we'll start off with the Dodge Magnum. Again, we ran it with the Mopar Performance dual plane intake manifold, a 750 Brawler carburetor, and long tube headers with an MSD distributor. Obviously, we optimize the timing and the air fuel from the carburetor to make as much power as we could from this combination. I would like to have done an EFI version of this comparison with running the factory Magnum Kegger intake manifold, and then the Ford EFI from the factory, and then the Chevrolet VORTEC Spider fuel injection. But the problem is I've never run the Spider fuel injection from the VORTEC stuff on the small block Chevy. We've only run it carbureted, so I have to bring you guys all of these junkyard versions with carburation rather than fuel injection. Although I suspect that with fuel injection, we would see a similar thing here, because I've run the other two and we kind of know what they do. But on the Dodge, the Magnum run on the engine dyno with an electric water pump, so no accessories, the long tube headers, the carburation, optimized tune, obviously. The 360 Magnum produced 301 horsepower and 403 foot-pounds of torque. We can vary those numbers a little bit depending on what temperature oil and temperature water we run, but this thing really is about a 300 horsepower motor that also makes about 400 foot-pounds of torque, which is a good amount of torque, and why the Magnum feels pretty good down low, like in a truck application. They were kind of designed to enhance torque production. It's interesting to note that the factory Magnum, which they produced from 92 to 2003, I think the years are correct, was rated at 245 horsepower and 335 foot-pounds of torque. So a difference of about 90 foot-pounds, or you know, when you compare the peak horse number and the peak torque number, there's a difference of about 90, and we're seeing about 100 here, so it kind of puts it right in line with what we would expect. Here's what happened when we compare this to the Ford. You can see the Ford 351 Windsor made a lot less power. Now the Ford was available from 1987 to 92, so it actually predated these others. These others were later and I think had more development in them than the Ford did. The Ford was rated at 210 horsepower, but 325 foot-pounds of torque, so really only 10 foot-pounds less than the Magnum. and yet it still made quite a bit less power when we ran it on the engine dyno. We also ran this with a 750 carburetor. We ran it with a dual plane intake manifold and long tube headers like we did with the Magnum, but it made quite a bit less power. The Ford produced 254 horsepower and 352 foot-pounds of torque. So again, about 100, different between the peak horsepower and peak torque, which is kind of what we would expect, and in line with the peak numbers that are offered by the factory. But what do you guys think? Do you think that this thing should have made more horsepower? Do you think that this was a not very powerful version? Because again, we got this from the wrecking yard. Was it not a good example of the 351? We've run a number of them, and they all kind of seem to be right here. And this thing, when responded very well, we started this as the baseline for a later upgrade that we did with a bunch of Edelbrock stuff on it, and it responded very well when we put good heads and cam and intake manifold on it. But starting out, it just didn't seem to make the power that the Magnum does. So now we'll compare the Magnum to the small block 350 small block Chevy. See how that does. Now that we've compared the Magnum to the 351 Windsor, it's time to see how well the 350 VORTEC Chevy can do against the Magnum. Now, in defense of the small block Chevy compared to the Ford, it was later than the Ford, so it had more evolution. And I think that probably other than the LT1, the reverse cooling LT1, the VORTEC was kind of the high watermark for the small block Chevy development before they jumped over to the LS versions. So the small block Chevy was rated at 255 horsepower and 330 foot-pounds of torque. So a little bit less torque, rated at about 5 foot-pounds less than the Magnum, but rated at 10 horsepower more than the Magnum in terms of peak. And that one, where the Ford went from 87 to 96 and the Dodge from 92 to 2003, the Chevy was available from 96 to 2002. So kind of comparable, more comparable with the Dodge than with the Ford, because Ford switched over to the modular platform and then they were offering the 5.4 liter. So here's our Magnum making about 300 horsepower and 400 foot-pounds. And here is the small block Chevy. Small block Chevy actually made almost identical power, peak power, right at 300, and then made, we were at 301, 300.6, and peak torque checked in at 384 foot-pounds. So it did well, not quite as well as the larger Magnum. Although I have to show you I ran a number of these small blocks, as I have these other motors as well, except for the Magnum. I've only run 2 of those. But on another one of the VORTECs, I ran one that made more power. I mean, it made 313 horsepower, and peak torque checked in at 398 foot-pounds. It had a little bit better intake. It had an air gap intake manifold on it, and it had a 750 carburetor. It had the 1 3/4 long tube headers that we always run on the small block. So most of them that I've run, I think we've run 5 or 6 of them, are closer to the 300 horsepower version. The other one was one of the best ones that I've seen. It was all stock, but it did make more power, but it was run with the air gap as opposed to the others being the standard RPM or some other version of the dual plane intake manifold. And I have to say that if we compare these and the Chevy guys jump up and down and say that they won, that's perfectly fine. That's why we're looking at all the data. But I can tell you that in a recent test that we did with the guys from Engine Masters, when we put the RPM air gap in place of the M1 dual plane, the RPM air gap for the Dodge is quite a bit better than the M1 is. In fact, in some areas, it was making 15 horsepower or 15 foot-pounds better. So I think a lot of what you get here is going to depend on your individual choices, especially for the intake manifold. And we see that a little bit with a Ford, too. An RPM air gap is kind of the standard of the industry for dual planes, for these kinds of mild applications, certainly. And then others would be obviously give you different results. But even if we took the best case scenario for the Chevy and took the 310 horsepower version, if you take a look at the torque below 3,600, the Magnum still made more torque down low, and probably this would be even more so down at 2,000 or 2,500, which we didn't do. And part of that is going to be, given these intake manifolds, part of that it has to be attributed to the fact that it has 9 more or 10 more cubic inches than the 350 and 9 more than the small block Ford. So cubic inches are one of the easiest ways to make especially additional low speed power, because nothing really enhances the power production down low the way that displacement does. You know, compression does a little bit. Cam timing, very little down at 2,000 or 2,500 RPM. Long runner intakes definitely do that, which the Magnum, which they all kind of had because they're designed for truck applications. They have mild cam time and they also have long runner intake manifolds. So they're all designed to enhance power production right there. So the question is, which one is best? Is the Magnum the clear winner? Is the one Chevy that we ran better? The small block even, you know, kind of equaled the Magnum, which is kind of what we would expect, although it was rated a little bit more, as much as 10 horsepower more. So is this one that made about 10 horsepower more really indicative of what you get? Really, between the Chevy and the Dodge, I think you're splitting hairs, except down low. I think the extra cubic inches probably are a little bit better. Let's get to our conclusion. Okay, guys, what do we learn from our comparison between the Chevy 350 VORTEC motor, the Ford 351 Windsor, and then the slightly larger Dodge 360 Magnum? Well, we learned the following things. First of all, the later the motors get, they have more evolution and they end up usually making more power. So that's why the Chevy and the Dodge probably make more power than the Ford. They had more development time because Ford switched over to the modular program while the others were continuing with the development of their small block. So eventually they would make more power. The other thing is bigger is better. As we saw with the Dodge Magnum, you can argue whether or not the VORTEC Chevy makes a little bit more power on the peak department compared to the Dodge. But I don't think there's any way to argue with the fact that the larger 360 Magnum is going to make more power down low, especially where you'll want it for a truck. Is that going to make Dodge guys choose the Chevy or Chevy guys choose the Dodge? Probably not. If you already have a Dodge, you're going to want to put a Dodge in it. If you've got a Duster or a Satellite or something and you want to put a small block and you're looking at a 360 Magnum, which would be a good choice, you're going to put a Magnum in there. Chances are you're probably not going to put a small block Chevy in there. But is that going to stop a small block Chevy guy from getting a small block Chevy and rather putting a Dodge in it? Probably not, because he's probably also a Chevy guy. And the reality is we looked at all of these, and with the exception of the 351 Windsor that just didn't have the development time, it didn't really have good cylinder heads, and you know, it lost power compared to the other two. With the exception of that, the Chevy and the Dodge made very comparable power. So there's not a lot to choose from there. So if you're a Chevy guy, you're going to pick that. If you're a Dodge guy, you're going to pick that. If you're a Ford guy, it's time to upgrade the 351. I'm Richard Holder. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff. I'll keep testing.